Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I wanted to talk about Black History Month and what folks like myself can do to not make it weird. So it's important to read diversely throughout the year, and there's lots of other months that focus on different cultural groups, and that's all important. But it feels like this year it's more essential that we sort of double down on celebrating Black History Month, just because I feel like there's so many in the US government especially that are sort of working tirelessly to stamp out anything that promotes diverse thinking, diverse reading, and that just makes me sad. So I wanted to do a video about Black History Month, and I wanted to address some of the misconceptions that I think a lot of people have, especially in the bookish community, about what we can do to sort of help the Black community and celebrate books written by Black authors. So one misconception that I see here and there, it's not super common, but I do see it every now and then, is that some people find it difficult to read a book featuring a Black protagonist if they are not Black themselves. They find it difficult to connect with that protagonist. And I feel like books should challenge you to inhabit sort of different perspectives and see different ways of looking at the world, because not only does that sort of challenge preconceptions, which is always good, but it fosters empathy. And I think we need a lot more empathy in the world right now, because in the online space, a lot of times it has this tendency towards pushing people to be seen as sort of characters or like two-dimensional faces on a screen and not as real three-dimensional people. And so there's more tendencies online to treat people with a little less empathy. People tend to get angrier more easily. People tend to be more insulting because they don't feel the consequence of like being in the same room with someone. And so we really need more of that empathy in the world. And so one way we can foster that is by reading books that feature characters from different walks of life than yourself, the different perspectives, different life experiences. And I think that's really important because it pushes you outside of your comfort zone in good ways. Now, there are some books where the main character is meant to be sort of a cipher, and they're just sort of like a human-shaped glove that you fit into so you can experience the story from their point of view. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I do think it is important to read books that feature viewpoints different from your own and feature people that are different from you, because it just expands your brain in interesting ways and teaches you about different ways of looking at the world. But it's also just fun sometimes because it's unexpected and you get to inhabit a community that's not your own. A really good example of this, not even talking about people's cultural background, but if you're reading something like The Hobbit, you know, no one on Earth is a hobbit. That is a fictional people in a fantasy book. But we can relate to hobbits because we relate to the things that are the same between us and hobbits. With that said, you can still read about hobbits, and even though you're not a hobbit yourself, you can still kind of relate to them, and you can relate to their experiences and their needs and wants and the things that change within them. So, whenever people say, oh, I can't read anything that doesn't feature someone who's exactly like me, what they're usually really saying is just, I can't read about other cultures because I don't have any interest in learning about those other cultures. Now, I mean, the genre of book might be something that you're not particularly interested in. That's valid, but be more open to reading books featuring protagonists that don't look like yourself, because it is good for you, I promise. Another good example about this is that I am not a Chinese American woman who is struggling with a relationship with my Chinese mother. That's not me at all, but I can read Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club and get a lot out of that book because there's still so much humanity in that story that is universal. Even if my experiences are different from the experiences of the characters, it still reaches me in important ways, and I really, really enjoyed that book, and it had a really big kind of emotional impact on me. So be willing to to visit other brains and experience other minds and viewpoints, because you'll find stuff that you relate to with the characters, even if the character has a different background from you or a different lived experience than you. It is still possible to connect with that person in interesting ways. And so here are some book recommendations for books written by Black authors featuring Black characters that I really, really enjoyed. We're going to start off with a graphic novel, and that is Far Sector by N.K. Jemisin. This is a DC Universe graphic novel. It's set, the main character is a Green Lantern. It's a self-contained story. You don't need to know anything about sort of the DC Universe. It's not really that important, because this is sort of what's important is this main character. But this is such a great story. And the artwork was done by Jamal Campbell, and it's just stunning. I love the way this book looks, and it has so much to say about mob mentality and cultural violence and segregation. There's a lot in here, and this is a really, really enjoyable read. And if you're someone who doesn't really enjoy reading that much, but you want to kind of celebrate Black History Month somehow, this is a great way to do it, because graphic novels are books, even though people like to think they aren't. And if you have someone who isn't much of a reader but wants to maybe start reading, this is always a great way to kind of get them invested. And if you are a reader, there's still plenty of depth and character arc and plot and everything in this to make it a satisfying reading experience. So don't brush these off just because it's a graphic novel. Next up is one that I just finished reading recently, and that is Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And there's a cat here, she has lots to say. This is probably one of the best books by Toni Morrison that I've read so far. I've read 4 of her books total. This book was absolutely outstanding. It's a story about family, about growing up, about finding your people, finding your connection to the things in life that make you want to care, because the main character sort of feels lost and disconnected from a lot of the people around him. And there's also like a story about like lost gold and a quest for this treasure. It's so good, and the way she writes character and setting is wonderful. The dialogue in this book is phenomenal. Another one, this is a YA fantasy, and that is Blood of the Root by Ladarian Williams. He has the second book coming out soon. I'm very excited for this one. This is sort of a send-up of the Wizard School series idea, but it's set in America. It features a Black protagonist, and it gets into sort of ancestral magic and culture and family, and he writes so engagingly. The characters are sort of flawed, and they struggle with a lot of different things, but they're still people that you want to root for. And the school setting is a lot of fun. The mysteries at the heart of all of this are really, really interesting, and so I cannot wait to continue with this series, but this is definitely one that I would recommend. This is another one that I think people have read in school or they've heard about, but it is worth reading, and that is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This is the story of sort of a woman who is sort of unlucky in love, and she kind of goes through 3 different husbands, and the first 2 are just garbage until she finally finds someone who is decent and willing to sort of treat her well, and it's sort of this just journey of self-discovery, but that sort of makes it seem like this is kind of a drudge. This is a funny book. It is delightful. She writes dialogue with such authenticity. She captures the nuance of dialect and the quirky things that make people weird. There's even kind of a strange part where we get inside the minds of sort of a group of animals. I don't know. It's great. There's a big moment with like a hurricane that's a ton of fun. This book is wonderful, and a lot of times people will see a book like this and think that it's sort of, you know, like the Oprah book club stereotype, where they're sort of all about feelings and all about just making people feel good about themselves with sort of platitudes, and it's sort of self-indulgent and all that. And that's not at all what this is. This is genuinely a wonderful, delightful, fun book. It's not very long. It's got a great pace, and the main character, Janie, seeing her sort of going through like ridiculous marriages and moving on and finding another one, and then he's kind of garbage too, and just all the people that she meets and her sense of sort of realizing, wait a minute, I'm worth being treated well. And it ends well, and it's a fun, delightful, wonderful book. Zora Neale Hurston is great, would highly recommend her. And then I've got a novel by N.K. Jemisin, and I know a lot of people like to talk about the Broken Earth trilogy, and while that one is really fantastic, I really enjoyed it, it's quite literary, and for someone who is sort of wanting to be introduced to N.K. Jemisin, it can be a little intimidating sometimes. And so if you want to kind of introduce yourself to N.K. Jemisin's writing, I would suggest The City We Became. It's book one of a duology. There's also a short story of hers that's in the book How Long Till Black Future Month, and that short story was kind of the seed that became this story. So the prologue or the first chapter of this book kind of is almost the same as that short story. So if you are wanting to check it out, that's definitely one. But it's I don't even know how to describe this. It's like urban-ish fantasy where the characters are sort of living embodiments of the different boroughs of New York, and they're all kind of in the process of New York becoming sort of a sentient great city, and they're fighting this eldritch horror that's very Lovecraftian in interesting ways, that's seeking to kind of destroy the city before it can become alive. And they're aided sometimes by the personifications of other cities around the world that have kind of attained this sentience. It's great, but it's funny, it's scary, it's heartbreaking at times, it's emotionally devastating, but it's empowering in others. The cast of characters is diverse and interesting and quirky and so much fun, and I really genuinely adored this. This book and its sequel have such just a fun energy to it. It makes you feel patriotic about New York, even if you're not a New Yorker. I've never been to New York in my whole life, but after kind of reading this, you kind of feel like, wow, New York's amazing. So this is one of hers that I would definitely recommend. The 5th season is also really good. The Broken Earth trilogy is probably her masterpiece, but it can be a little intimidating because there's different perspectives, and it deals with some pretty heavy stuff, and you kind of have to really sort of work through it at a steady pace. You can't just rush through it. This one, you can breeze through it a little bit faster because it's more fun. It's kind of got this Scooby-Doo sort of feel. The group of people all sort of come together and they have to sort of help defeat this vast, unknowable evil that's trying to take over the city. It's great, would highly recommend it. Next up, I wanted to talk about nonfiction, and one of the misconceptions that I see online about nonfiction written by Black authors is that it's often sort of attacking white people, or it's just mean and angry, and it's trying to make them feel guilty about everything and saying everything that's bad in the world is your fault, and that's not it at all. All of the sort of like anti-racist critical theory and Black history, all of those books that I've read, they're not about attacking white people and casting blame. What they are is they're talking about the systems that have been in place for a long time that disenfranchise Black people or hurt Black communities in ways that most people haven't heard about. So a lot of times these books are meant to sort of build bridges and to sort of show the ways in which white supremacy exists, the way that it's harmed people, and the way that other non-Black people can sort of deconstruct their own assumptions, because there's a lot of white supremacist ideas and thinking that is so pervasive that you don't even think about it. It's very easy to sort of accidentally feed into that sort of white supremacist thinking, even if you're not a hateful person yourself. The word racist isn't like a hateful, evil slur that says you're like the worst person ever. It's all about saying these are racist ideas and stereotypes that you need to be aware of so you can avoid them, so you can work towards being sort of an anti-racist ally and it's a long process, and no one's perfect, and everyone is sort of working through this at their own pace. But when you read books like these, it's not about attacking you and saying all of this is your fault personally and you're a bad person. It's saying these are ways that you can deconstruct your own place within white supremacy so as to be more open to building bridges and connecting with people from other cultural backgrounds, and to be aware of the ways in which you might be unwittingly harming others, or just making sort of ignorant statements or ignorant assumptions, or consuming media that promotes ignorant stereotypes, that kind of stuff. And so that's why I think it's important to read this stuff. A lot of times, white supremacist thinking is something that harms everyone, not just Black communities. And so when you read nonfiction books, especially like critical race theory, which isn't some terrifying boogeyman like some extremist news sources like to tout it as, but it's just all about finding ways that you can sort of pull yourself out of sort of the white supremacist normal reality that sort of everyone lives in, and being aware of how that system works, so you can do little things here and there to combat that in your daily life. Basically, all of these books are all about changing the narrative from rich white men get to control the narrative and control things so that they always have the most money and the most influence and everything, and just changing it to everybody has an equal opportunity to contribute to society in meaningful ways without having to worry about silly things like their skin color or race, which is sort of a made-up concept anyways, or their social class, or any of these other kind of culturally reinforced categories that don't ultimately make a lot of sense, but using those to sort of make some people feel like they are better or more able to succeed than others. It's more about leveling the playing field and letting people just live their lives and being themselves. Anti-racist books, Black history, biographies of important Black figures are really important because it allows us to strip away kind of the veneer of white supremacy and work towards a world in which sort of everything benefits everyone equally, which is what we want. So here are some great recommendations. A few of these I read recently via the library, so I don't have a physical copy of them yet, but I do definitely want one. But one that's really important is Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism by Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is incredible. I've read 2 of her books apart from this one as well. She's such a smart thinker, and she gets at the way things work, and she does such a good job of saying this is how we can make things better, not just saying this is why things are bad and I'm mad about it. It's saying this is how things work, these are the intersections of all the different strata of society, and this is how things work, so that this is how we can then move beyond that in a way that benefits everyone and allows people to sort of get past a lot of these meaningless hang-ups over things that ultimately don't matter. Another one, and I've talked about this before, is The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is a collection of essays, and they seem to be kind of on different subjects, but what they are about is sort of the way in which white supremacy is sort of accepted and part of everyday life, and the way that it influences the way people act, and the steps that people need to take in order to sort of realize that and step out of that kind of way of thinking, because it's so pervasive. And he looks at a lot of different perspectives. There's also a really fantastic section in here where he talks about overcoming his own preconceptions about Gaza and the way he changed his worldview. And it's just really fantastic. He's also just an entertaining writer. He's captivating. He's got a really quick, engaging way of writing, and it's a lot of fun. The audiobook is also great. Would recommend that one. Another book that I just finished reading was Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Thought in America by Ibram X. Kendi. This book was phenomenally good. He looks at sort of the way that public opinion towards race was shaped and the way it evolved over the years, because there was always sort of all these different philosophies that people came up with to sort of describe the difference between white people and Black people, and and describe how the world worked. He talks about the influence of religious theories. He talks about scientific theories that came and went and fell out of favor, and just the way that people tried to sort of explain the differences in the races, whereas ultimately race is a meaningless thing, but it is something that affects the way people live because people place so much stock in it. And so you can say that, race doesn't exist, which it doesn't. Race doesn't exist. Economic status is sort of meaningless. Gender is a spectrum. It's not a rigid binary. But because people believe that race is a thing that exists and that economic status and your level in society is important, these things do affect people. And so this book sort of gets at the way that these systems and these beliefs were sort of perpetuated by the government, the scientific institution, the church throughout the years, and the way that those beliefs changed and evolved over time. And it's really fascinating. Would highly recommend it. Another one that I really, really enjoyed was the 1619 Project. This is edited by Nicole Hannah-Jones. This is an anthology of essays, poetry, short story excerpts. It originally was something that appeared kind of in sections in the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times Magazine, and then they were collected and added to in this collection. And this is a very dense collection. There's so much in here, but they touch on every topic of sort of how white supremacy has impacted Black communities throughout the years in every sort of strata of society, in every sort of area. There's things about medicine, there's things about religion, there's things about gender. It's really, really fascinating, and the people who contributed to this did such a fantastic job. And I love the way it blends fiction and nonfiction. You get poetry that gets at sort of the heart and soul of these communities and their beliefs and the things that scare them and the things that they love, and then it juxtaposes that with sort of scholarship that is very rigorously researched and well presented. And overall, this is just a really eye-opening and fantastic anthology of writings. So good. And then finally, another one. This is another anthology, and that is In Search of Our Mother's Gardens by Alice Walker. This is a collection of her nonfiction. Alice Walker is the writer of The Color Purple, which is a book that I love dearly. It's a collection of a bunch of different kinds of writings. There's personal narratives here, there's scholarly articles, there's like journalism, and it just is such a good insight into the way Alice Walker sort of saw the world and the way that she's sort of able to distill it all down. There's one essay in here called Beauty When the Other Dancer is the Self. I think that's the title, where she talks about how she lost one of her eyes in a childhood accident, and growing up with sort of this missing eye, and the way that she saw it, and then the way that her daughter saw it when she got older. And it's so good. It's just beautifully written, and especially at the beginning when she describes the moment when she lost her eye, it's just brutal, but it's so good. Alice Walker is a really fantastic writer. Now, in recent years, she has become sort of controversial. She's sort of made some unusual comments on social media and in interviews that feel kind of anti-Semitic, which isn't good. And so we need to understand that these people are human beings and they're flawed, and nothing of those beliefs, you don't see that in her earlier writing. So I feel like we can still enjoy her writing, both fiction and nonfiction, even if we want to kind of step away from kind of the person as she is now, because it seems like she's sort of fallen into some odd rabbit holes. I hope that was just sort of a temporary thing, and whatever, because she's a brilliant writer and she's a brilliant thinker and she's an important person. And so it's always kind of disappointing when you see someone sort of falling down kind of a dangerous mode of thinking, because we don't want to give in to prejudice of any kind, and especially anti-Semitism, because I know right now there's the whole thing with criticisms of the Israeli government and the events in Gaza, but we should never use that as an excuse to attack Jewish people in general or make wild, unsubstantiated claims about Jewish people in America. So that's my little soapbox moment, but Alice Walker is still important, and this is a wonderful collection of nonfiction writings that we should definitely keep reading. Another misconception that I want to touch on when reading Black books, especially this is something I still see even with allies, there's this idea that reading diversely, or specifically reading books by Black writers, is sort of work that you sort of have to do, and I don't really like that at all. It's sort of this idea that you can read fun books, but then every now and then you have to sort of force yourself to, it's like, forcing yourself to take medicine or to eat like a bran muffin, even though I like bran muffins, to sort of get your vitamins, and then you can go back to reading stuff you actually enjoy. And I hate this viewpoint, because what it does is it sets it up as something that you kind of are forced to do and that you feel like you are obligated to. And that just doesn't make anyone feel great. It's sort of like if you have a family member who every Christmas, instead of giving you something that they chose for you, something that they know you'd like, something that shows that they sort of understand your interests, they just sort of give you something perfunctory just for the sake of it, because they feel like they have to give you a gift, and it's sort of an obligation for them, and it's a burden, and if they don't give you a gift, then you'll be mad. And so that's kind of what it ends up feeling like. It's sort of like if you're going to read diversely just because you feel like you have to, or it's something that you sort of have to do to like check off a little card that says, by the way, I'm not racist because I read this book, now I'm going to go back to reading the stuff I really like. It's so disingenuous, and it's just not a great thing. And I don't like this. Don't read books by Black authors because you feel like you have to do it in order to be labeled a good person, because that's just performative and meaningless. Read books by Black authors because they're good. There's a ton of different authors in a ton of different genres doing really fun things, and fiction and nonfiction in all different types of books. There's so much good stuff. And because of the sort of baked-in white supremacy of the universe, so often those books are forgotten, or they don't show up very much, or people see them and think that they're going to be something that they're not, and so they don't want to read them because they see books written by Black authors as sort of work that they have to do, rather than just fun books that you can enjoy. And we really need to get past that mode of thinking. It's sort of like, I'm going to read all the fun stuff that I enjoy, and then when I get to February, I'm going to force myself to read stuff that I have to read because I need to, and that's gross. I like to only focus on books by Black authors in this month just to sort of celebrate them, but there's authors that I really genuinely love to read throughout the year anyways, and it's not a performative thing to do. It's just saying, there's authors out there that are really good that I like. Another misconception, I guess, not a really misconception, another thing that I wanted to mention, focusing more on nonfiction written by any author, really. This applies to anybody. But when you're reading history, especially history of marginalized peoples or things that aren't really talked about as often in school and whatnot, one thing that you want to be aware of is nuance, because nuance on social media doesn't really exist. No one's ever going to sort of see things as multifaceted. But one thing that it's good to read in nonfiction books, especially books of critical race theory, is being aware of the nuance of what makes people people. And so people can be flawed, they can change, they can grow, they can learn. And so you never want to see any one person as sort of a monolith or a paragon of any sort. There's some authors that you'll read that you're like, I really like their perspectives and I really like the way they see things. And that's great, but it's also important to read books that challenge those assumptions, just so that you can sort of get as clear a picture of everything as possible. And a really good example of this is the writer Zora Neale Hurston. She is a really incredible novelist. She was an accomplished anthropologist, a really important one, a folklorist. She preserved so many sort of African-American folk tales and folklore from like Haiti and all over the place. Like, she really did a lot of really good work, and her writing is incredible, and I really, really love her work. But she tended to be very conservative, and you read about her, and she was quite an outrageous kind of character, and she was really important for the Harlem Renaissance at the beginning. But she did sort of end up alienating herself from her community because of her political views. She was quite conservative. She didn't quite like FDR's New Deal, which there's nuance there too. It was sort of designed to help everyone, but it didn't help everyone equally. But it would have helped in at least some extent poor Black communities who really needed the help. And she opposed that. And some of the things she talked about, she sort of alienated some friendships. She wrote the play Mulebone with Langston Hughes, who's another towering figure in the Harlem Renaissance. And writing this play actually ended their friendship because they did not get along. Ultimately, her views were just too much for Hughes, who just, they never reconciled. This play was never performed then. I think it was performed years and years later for the first time. I haven't read this one yet, but I do have it. But so we need to be aware that we don't want to see any one person as sort of being like this paragon, and we say, okay, they're perfect, they're flawless, they did work in their life that was sort of anti-racist, and so there's no flaws in their life, they did nothing wrong, they were perfect, and we should be exactly like them, because no person is going to be like that. Another good example is W.E.B. Du Bois, who's a really important figure, but in the book Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram X. Kendi talks about how his views changed as he got older, and when he was younger, he did have some sort of like internalized racist views that colored the things that he said and the things that he wrote about. And through his life, he sort of began to unravel those threads and began to sort of change his viewpoint on things. And so his earlier writings are quite different from sort of his later beliefs and writings. And so it's, he was an important figure, and we definitely need to read about his stuff, but we need to be aware that people are flawed, and that white supremacy is so pervasive that so many of us internalized white supremacist ideas without even thinking about it. From everything from like TV shows to random comments to comedy, like it's everywhere. And so we need to be aware of that. And so when you're reading books, it's always good if you connect with someone and be like, wow, I really love what they have to say. Their viewpoints are so insightful, and I really love that. It is still important to read books by other Black authors, especially if they critique the writings of the others, because you'll kind of get a better nuanced view of the complex issues, because nothing is ever simple. And it's a great way to sort of challenge your preconceptions and to make sure that you're always learning and evolving. And my final point, and I'm almost done here, I promise. If you're a bookish content creator, make sure that when you're diversifying your reading or decolonizing your bookshelf, you're doing it because it'll open yourself up to so many wonderful new writers, not as a performative act to be like, look, I've diversified my bookshelf, clap for me, now I'm going to go back to reading Sarah J. Maas only, So don't do it as a performative action, because that's meaningless. Do it because there's so many authors that are incredible that if you kind of listen to the public opinion, you won't hear about them very often. A really good example of this is the book Kindred by Octavia Butler. This book is wonderful. So I read this in college, and our teacher was he was teaching a class that was sort of about cross-cultural American voices, and there was a lot of different authors from different cultural backgrounds talking about the American experience. And we read this book, and I remember really enjoying it. It's speculative fiction, there's time travel, there's a modern woman getting thrown into the past every now and then, having to solve a problem in her own past, and it's great. It's imaginative, it's compelling, it's so good. But so many people in the class hated this book. They said that it was like YA, they said that it wasn't realistic, they said they couldn't connect with the character, and they didn't like it at all. And so it got to the point where the teacher actually stopped teaching this in that class for future classes, because the reaction was so negative. And I sort of internalized that a little too much. I thought, well, if all these people don't like it, then it must not be really great. And so I traded away my copy that I had gotten for the class, and I'd never read anything by Octavia Butler for years. And it wasn't until sort of the years right up until the beginning of Book Talk on Twitter, back when it was good, before it became awful, I sort of reconnected with writers and book blogger types who talked about how much they loved Octavia Butler. And I remembered that I did genuinely really enjoy this book, but I had sort of allowed public opinion in that one class to convince me that, oh, it wasn't very good and I needed to stop reading it. So I got the book again. This is the new copy that I got. And I started reading her other stuff. I read her Xenogenesis, Lilith Brood trilogy, and then the Earthseed duology, and there's another series, the Patternist series, that I haven't read yet. But I really connected with her. I love Octavia Butler. She's this towering figure in science fiction, and she does so much incredible work, and her books are insightful and cool, and they just explode your brain because she's so brilliant. And I had missed out on that because I had given in to sort of the public opinion in this class where they said that they didn't like it because they thought it was YA and silly, which is stupid. And so I now really enjoy her work, and I'm sort of catching up and making for lost time and reading her work because I genuinely really, really like it. But I didn't get the opportunity to do that if it hadn't been for the people online talking about how much they loved her and sort of bringing her back into the sort of conversation, and not just talking about sort of the popular, sort of more mainstream white authors that were popular at the time, and sort of really pushing this book and being like, no, this book is good actually. And it reminded me, of course it was good actually. I loved it. And so I got it again. I started reading her other stuff, and I'm really glad I did. So that's why it's important to sort of diversify your reading, because even if you don't think about it, it's so easy to be influenced by public opinion and by the lack of diversity in sort of the popular books of the day. I'm glad things are getting more diverse now, which is good, but there's still a long way to go. And so it's important that we uplift the authors that we genuinely love, who connect with us and make us happy and explode our brain and, you know, make us laugh out loud. It's important that we do that because books by Black authors so often sort of fall to the wayside or get ignored in favor of like the super blockbuster writers that everyone is always talking about. You know, if you're on social media and you talk about Sarah J. Maas or Brandon Sanderson, you're going to get tons of engagement because that's what everyone wants to read. And if you write a book about Octavia Butler, you'll get some engagement from the people who really like her, but it won't be nearly to that level. And so it's important to always be kind of pushing Black authors to fight against the algorithm. And that's why Black History Month is important, because it's sort of a time where we can put extra effort into uplifting Black writers whom you love, not because you feel like you have to, or because you do it just for kind of performative allyship, which isn't ultimately very valuable. You do it because these are authors that you love, that you enjoy, that you really connect with, and you're desperate for other people to read them so you can talk about them with other people who share your interest. And that's why Black History Month is important. So, with that rant aside, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.